the California silver town that died twice and came back. The true story of Calico, California, and the man who refused to let it vanish. There's a stretch of the Mojave Desert in Southern California, out along Interstate 15, on the long run between Barstow and Las Vegas, where the mountains look like someone spilled paint across them. Reds and pinks, soft greens, rust and gold, all banded together in the bare rock. These hills had been crossed for countless generations by the native peoples of the desert, long before any prospector gave them a name. When those prospectors finally came, they thought the painted slopes looked like calico cloth, the printed cotton their wives and mothers sewed into dresses back home. So they called the peak Calico. They called the whole range Calico. And when a town rose at the foot of those painted hills almost overnight, they called it Calico too. For about 15 years, this was one of the richest silver towns in the American West. Then the silver gave out, the people left, and the desert began taking the buildings back, board by board. Calico should have vanished completely, the way 100 other desert camps did. Instead, it was bought, rebuilt, and brought back to life by the same man who would go on to build Knott's Berry Farm. This is the story of a town that died, came back, and is still standing today, for a reason almost nobody expects. The story really begins in 1881. California had already lived through its great gold rush a generation earlier, and by now, the easy fortunes were long gone. But the deserts of the southern part of the state still held their secrets. That year, a small party of prospectors pushed up into the painted hills northeast of a railroad stop called Grapevine Station, the place we now call Barstow, and struck a vein of silver so rich it stopped them cold. They named their claim the Silver King. It would become the largest silver mine in all of California in the years that followed. The mine took its name from a man who never swung a pick in it. John C. King was the sheriff of San Bernardino County, and he had grub-staked the prospectors, fronting them the money and the supplies they needed to go looking. When the silver came in, his name went on the richest mine of all. Remember John King. He is the thread that ties this whole story together, from the very first strike all the way to the town's rescue more than 70 years later. The Silver King was not alone for long. Mines with names like the Oriental and the Bismarck cut into the same rich ground, and the ore here turned out to be unusually easy money. The deposits lay close to the surface, and the rock was firm enough that miners didn't need the expensive timbering and heavy machinery that drained so many other camps. Low costs, rich ore, that was the formula. By the middle of the decade, San Bernardino County was producing the great majority of all the silver mined in California, and the lion's share of that came from these painted hills. Word of the strike traveled fast, the way it always did. Within a couple of years, the painted hills were honeycombed with more than 500 mines and prospects. A town built itself out of the rock and the heat, and Calico grew into something raucous and real. At its height, in the mid-1880s, around 1,200 people lived there. There were hotels and boarding houses, general stores and a meat market, a school, a Wells Fargo office, and even a telephone and telegraph line strung clear across the open desert. And there were saloons, by one count, 22 of them, along with a red light district and a Chinatown, where Chinese laborers ran the laundries and kitchens at the edge of the camp. The people who came were from everywhere. Alongside the Americans were miners from China, England, Ireland, Greece, France, and the Netherlands, a whole world crowded onto one dusty desert ridge, all of it chasing the same silver. In 1882, a printer named John Overshiner arrived with a small press and started a weekly newspaper. He gave it one of the great names in frontier journalism. He called it the Calico Print. All told, the mines around Calico would give up something like $20 million in silver, an almost unimaginable sum for the time. Every boomtown collects its characters, and Calico had more than its share. There was a dog named Dorsey, a black and white shepherd who, the story goes, was trained to carry the mail. With little leather pouches strapped across his back, Dorsey trotted the rough miles between the Calico post office and the mining camp at Bismarck, hauling letters back and forth when no one else would make the run. He became so famous that nearly a century later, the people at Disney made a television episode about him. There was Lucy Lane, who came to Calico as a girl and stayed on and off for the better part of 67 years. They called her the Queen of Calico. She watched the town boom, watched it empty out, and lived long enough to watch it come back to life as a tourist attraction. Her old home still stands, once the town's post office and courthouse, and today the town museum. And here is a fact almost nobody knows. Two of the men who held mining interests in these desert hills went on to become governors of California, serving back-to-back from 1887 to 1895. A rough little silver camp in the middle of the desert quietly helped send two men to the highest office in the state. Life in Calico was hard, and it was dangerous. Fire was a constant terror in a town built almost entirely of wood and canvas. And more than once, flames tore through the buildings, and the people simply rebuilt on the ashes. The rougher characters ended up on Boot Hill, the town's cemetery, where the weathered graves still sit out under the open desert sky. Then the desert offered up a second fortune. Just a few miles east of Calico, miners found borax, the white mineral that would soon turn up in soaps and cleaners in kitchens all across America. A camp called Borax sprang up in the canyons nearby, and many of Calico's miners drifted over to dig it. To get the borax out to the railroad at Daggett, teamsters hitched together long lines of mules, the famous 20-mule teams, and hauled enormous wagons across the open desert, a sight that became legendary all over the West. Over the years, those mines gave up millions of dollars in borax on top of all the silver, and for a while, the white mineral kept money flowing through Calico, even as the silver story neared its end. And that end came hard. In 1890, Congress passed a law that propped up the price of silver by having the government buy huge quantities of it. For a silver town like Calico, that law was everything. But just 3 years later, in the financial panic of 1893, the law was repealed, and the price of silver collapsed. It fell from more than $1 an ounce to around 60 cents. Almost overnight, the rich ore that had built Calico was no longer worth the cost of digging it out. The mines shut down one by one. The post office closed in 1898. The school followed. Families packed up and left, and many of the buildings were literally taken apart and hauled away to nearby towns to be rebuilt somewhere with a future. When the last of the borax operations wound down around 1907, Calico was finished. The painted hills fell silent. What had been one of the loudest, richest towns in the desert became, in the span of just a few years, a ghost. But Calico had one more chapter waiting, and it brings us right back to that name, King. John King's nephew was a young man named Walter Knott. Around 1915, Walter worked here in the dying town, helping build great redwood tanks for a plant that tried and failed to squeeze a little more silver out of the old ore. Calico didn't make him rich, but it stayed with him. Walter Knott went on to do something else entirely. With his wife Cordelia, he turned a roadside berry stand in Orange County into a restaurant, and then into one of the most famous amusement parks in the entire country, Knott's Berry Farm. And in the 1940s, drawing on his memories of the desert, he built a make-believe Old West ghost town as an attraction for his visitors. It was a hit, so Walter Knott asked himself a question almost no one had ever thought to ask. If you can build a pretend ghost town, why not save a real one? In 1951, he bought Calico, the very town his uncle's mine had built. He brought in his art director, Paul von Kleben, and using old photographs, Walter's own memory, and the recollections of a few old-timers still living nearby, they rebuilt it. They restored the handful of original buildings that still stood, and they reconstructed the ones that were gone. Knott spent something like $700,000 bringing the Painted Hills town back from the dead, and he installed a long-time employee, a man everyone knew as Calico Fred, as the town's caretaker and greeter. Some critics grumbled, then and now, that the rebuilt Calico looks a little too neat, more like a movie set than the rough camp it really was, and it's true that a lot of what you see is reconstruction. But the alternative was no Calico at all, and Walter Knott knew it. In 1966, rather than keep the town or cash it in, he gave Calico away, donating the whole place to San Bernardino County so that the public could have it for good. That gift is the reason you can still walk Calico's main street today. It is a county park now, 3 miles off Interstate 15, just outside Barstow, a living ghost town where you can tour a real silver mine, ride a narrow-gauge railroad through the old diggings, pan for gold, and stand inside Lucy Lane's house. Look up at the ridge behind the town, and you'll see giant white letters spelling out the name Calico across the painted rock, visible from the freeway for miles. In 1962, the town was made an official California historical landmark, and the state has gone further still. Calico is now the official Silver Rush ghost town of California, a companion to Bodie, up in the Eastern Sierra, which holds the title for the Gold Rush. The Painted Hills have a way of pulling people in. Musicians have filmed videos against Calico's weathered storefronts. The singer Kenny Rogers once recorded a whole album of songs about the town. And every year, it fills up again, for festival days, for a Halloween haunt, for reenactments. The streets crowded the way they hadn't been since the Silver days. And so Calico carries all of it at once, the painted peak that gave it a name, the Silver King, and the fortune that built a whole town in the middle of nowhere. The newspaper, the saloons, the Chinatown, the mail-carrying dog, the 2 governors, the Borax wagons and their long teams of mules, the crash that emptied the place out, and the strange second life it found when the nephew of the man who started it all decided that a real ghost town was worth saving. There are towns all over California that the desert simply erased, camps that boomed and busted and left nothing behind but a name on an old map. Calico was supposed to be one of them. Instead, because a few people refused to let it disappear, it is still here, still standing in those red and gold hills, still telling its story to anyone who turns off the highway to listen. Many people will never visit Calico. Many people never knew any of this happened. But now you know. That's the story of Calico, California, and we're just getting started. If this is your first time here at Lost California, welcome. Every week we go deep on the towns, the disasters, the scandals, the forgotten stories, and the hidden history that made California what it is today. Subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and leave a comment below telling us which California city or town you want us to cover next. We read every one. We'll see you there.